It's pretty clear to most of us that climate change is already a major crisis, perhaps even to the level of it being existential. Despite that dire assessment, we remain clueless on how to deal with it. Although the Genghis Khan's solution thankfully isn't on the table, he killed enough people while converting millions of acres of farmland to pasture, a number of the options seem similarly insane. For instance, a number of American scientists have proposed that we purposefully inject a significant amount of carbon into a layer of the atmosphere in order to diminish the sun's ability to reach the planet's surface. It's the equivalent of pulling a house shade down on our planet. Despite witnessing the worsening hurricanes, fiery infernos, and deadly droughts, I'm not yet ready to endorse a plan which seeks to blot out the sun. Our lack of response to the planet's urgent warnings appears to be absurd on face value. It is also predictable. The Guardian explained our hesitancy to confront the challenge in 2014, writing that human brains aren't wired to respond easily to large, slow-moving threats. Our brain is essentially a get-out-of-the-way machine, at least according to Daniel Gilbert, a professor of psychology at Harvard who is best known for his research into happiness. He continues, "That's why we can duck a baseball in milliseconds." While we have come to dominate the planet because of such traits, he says that threats that develop over decades rather than seconds circumvent the brain's alarm system. Many environmentalists say climate change is happening too fast. No, it's happening too slowly. It's not happening nearly quickly enough to get our attention. Humans are saddled with other shortcomings too. Loss aversion means we're more afraid of losing what we want in the short term than surmounting obstacles in the distance. Our built-in optimism bias irrationally projects sunny days ahead in spite of evidence to the contrary. In short, we can recognize a slow-moving crisis unfolding, but are oftentimes unable to act. Albert Einstein was faced with his own slow-moving existential threat in 1919, and then again in the 1930s. As war broke out upon the European continent, he not only saw the crisis unfolding, but did everything in his power to warn those around him to action. Unfortunately, few heeded his call, and World War I soon soaked Europe in death and destruction, plunging the continent into darkness. The subsequent rise of the Nazis was a global threat, which moved slowly enough for Adolf Hitler to be recognized as Time magazine's Man of the Year in 1938. 8 months earlier, Albert Einstein had graced the magazine's cover. The two men would find themselves diametrically opposed, with the physicists playing a role in the development of the world's most destructive weapon in an attempt to eradicate the threat posed by the Nazi Party to his native home. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series is about the man who remains synonymous with the term genius, Albert Einstein. Episode number 3, Europe's Last Pacifist. First of all, I'd like to clear up one thing that gets confused in our natural tendency to both connect the world wars as well as pit heroes versus villains. World War I began with the assassination of Austria-Hungary's Franz Ferdinand while he was touring the empire's land holdings in the former Yugoslavia. Austria-Hungary gave a 30-day ultimatum to hand over the terrorist, during which time Russia made it known to the world that it would see any military exercises in that region as a threat to its own hegemony, one that it would respond to with deadly force. Germany, a newly consolidated nation bereft of allies and frustrated at its lateness to the imperial party, decided to stand with its southern neighbor against Russia. Based upon the mistaken belief that France remained secretly aligned with the Russian Bear, the war expanded far more rapidly than anyone could have imagined. It was a war that the European powers sought, one that each believed would end in a splendid victory. There were no Nazis during World War I, and if you would like to, you can even make the case that Germany wasn't the bad guys, despite the fact that the Treaty of Versailles required them to take up that mantle. America could have easily justified standing with Germany, had she wanted to. A year prior to the Great War exploding across the continent, Albert Einstein accepted a job in Berlin at the Kaiser Wilhelm Society for the Advancement of the Sciences. The reasons for the career change are easy to understand. As the physicist's pay significantly increased, his teaching load disappeared completely, and he was generously granted a team of elite-level scientists to help with any experiment that he saw fit to investigate. In exchange, the Germans secured for themselves a native-born son who had already proven his scientific chops through the development of his theory of relativity. In his own words, Albert felt as though the gentlemen in Berlin are gambling on me as if I were a prize hen. As for myself, I don't even know whether I'm going to lay another egg. His appointment gave the newly consolidated German nation the chance to mimic and perhaps even surpass what the United States and England were doing with their elite scientists, merging science and government into what would ultimately become known as the industrial military complex. Although he wasn't an idiot, Albert ignored the dangers of such a thing, blissfully imagining that all elite scientists subscribed to their own Hippocratic oath of first doing no harm. Einstein was overly dramatic in his acceptance of the Berlin appointment, informing his recruiters to look for him along a mountain path. If he were seen carrying a white rose, then they would know that his answer was a no. But if the rose was red, then he would be theirs. It ought to have been an easy decision, as 8 out of the 10 men in the world that truly understood relativity lived in Berlin in 1913. But a requirement of the position forced him to somewhat reconsider his citizenship. Einstein, of course, had given up his German citizenship at the age of 16, and had since become a Swiss national. A new law in Berlin, however, dictated that anyone in employment to the state must be a German citizen. When Albert was informed of this, he attempted to snatch his red rose back. He was in such demand, however, that a compromise was found which allowed him to retain his Swiss citizenship while sidestepping the question posed by the nationality law through vague verbiage. Or at least that was the impression that Einstein was left with. We'll examine that misunderstanding later on. Believing that his demand had been met, Albert Einstein moved into the beating heart of the nation he had previously abandoned. In April of 1914, Albert felt as though he had hit the jackpot, as all of the German state's resources were suddenly available to him. He made great use of them, despite the fact that it is commonly retold that he only requested some pencils and a space to jot down his ideas. That myth is easily refuted, for Albert immediately put in a request for a major scientific expedition to measure light rays during an upcoming solar eclipse. He believed that such an expedition would be able to provide the definitive scientific proof that light bent due to gravity. Southern Russia was in the path of the August 21st eclipse, an uncomfortable detail as Germany declared war on the Russian Bear 20 days earlier. Einstein's team that was sent to gather measurements was arrested on suspicion of spying and had their equipment impounded. It was a costly mistake, as the next opportunity to measure an eclipse wouldn't come for another 5 years. Although it wasn't the principal cause, the stress of the failed experiment heaped more pressure upon the unstable house of cards that had become his marriage to Mileva. Her unhappiness had previously scuttled their move to Prague, and her melancholy in Berlin was easy to see. She desired more attention from her husband, desiring to be the cause of the spark in his eye, rather than a distraction to be managed. Faced with a choice, Albert chose work, letting his wife and their 2 children return to Switzerland without him. The 2 spouses would remain physically separated for the rest of the year. Historian Ronald Clark notes that there is a good deal of circumstantial evidence to suggest that Einstein was heartily glad to remain on his own while he got down to the hard work of completing the general theory. He would have liked to have remained oblivious to the war, but his colleagues had embraced the German militarism that Albert had fully rejected while suffering through militarized lessons in the Ludenpold Gymnasium. Science has always walked hand in hand with warfare. Canadian Prime Minister John Abbott even proclaimed that war is the science of destruction. Leonardo da Vinci started his career designing military weapons. Isaac Newton had been an advisor to the British Academy, and Alfred Nobel invented dynamite. One of Einstein's assistants joined the German Air Ministry to help with the development of military aircraft. Another, an astronomer who had worked on the math needed for the general theory, volunteered to better calculate the needs of the German forces on the Eastern Front. And a professor which he admired, Fritz Haber, invented ammonia so that fertilizer, fuel, and explosives could be stockpiled during the long winter months. Haber would go on to try to convince Einstein to do his part for the war, puffing out his own chest while proclaiming that as a full professor of the university, he had the feeling that he was equivalent to a general. Albert Einstein, however, remained a staunch pacifist, waiting for the men whom he steadfastly believed to be the smartest in the world to wake up from their collective haze. The proper thing would have been to abandon his post in favor of his ideals, but Clark reveals that he was totally unwilling to abandon his work, even if it was being done at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. After all, he had proven willing to abandon his family for it. Legit criticism can be levied here towards the pacifist physicists. As one professor eloquently put it, Einstein knew that the sumptuous bed in which he lay was swarmed with bugs. In an effort to clarify his thoughts on the issue, he briefly put aside his work to criticize the recently published Manifesto to the Civilized World, which had been issued in early October of 1914 by a group of 93 prominent German scientists. Clark summarizes it for us, writing that it disclaimed Germany's war guilt, justified the violation of Belgium on the grounds that it would have been suicide to have done anything else, spoke of the Russian hordes unleashed against the white race, and claimed that were it not for German militarism, German culture would have been wiped off the face of the earth. Rather than signing the document, Einstein issued a counter-manifesto that began with, "Never before has any war so completely disrupted cultural cooperation. It has done so at the very time when progress in technology and communications clearly suggests that we recognize the need for international relations which will necessarily move us in the direction of a universal worldwide civilization." You don't need to be an expert on World War I to know that this wasn't the way that the typical German felt in 1914. Still, the Counter Manifesto was prophetic, as though the master of relativity had figured out a way to glimpse into the future. It continues. The struggle raging today can scarcely yield a victor. All nations that participate in it will, in all likelihood, pay an exceedingly high price. Hence, it appears not only wise but imperative for men of education in all countries to exert their influence for the kind of peace treaty that will not carry the seeds of future wars, whatever the outcome of the present conflict may be. Although it was circulated among all of the professors in Germany, only 2 others signed his Counter Manifesto, one of whom was an 80-year-old who had also signed the original proclamation. This didn't deter Einstein, however, who had never needed scientific proof to believe that his theories were correct. He put his name on the document and stood by it, proclaiming that his goal was to bring about a quick end to the war and then establishing an international body that would prevent future conflicts. Those statements, combined with the fact that Albert Einstein was ethnically Jewish, aligns everything you need to know to build a conspiracy theory that revolves around a secret international order of Jews who were willing to stab Germany in the back in order to end the war. He was unsuccessful in bringing about an end to the war, which brought misery to his work. He frustratingly proclaimed in letters that Berlin was a lunatic asylum and that Europe has gone insane, and that he belonged to an idiotic, rotten species that boasts of its freedom of will. He temporarily escaped the asylum in 1915 to check in on his estranged family before returning to his work in the German capital. By Easter of 1916, it had become clear that the gulf that separated the couple was impossible to bridge. He didn't handle it chivalrically, with Clark informing us that Albert had made the irrevocable decision not to see his wife again. Even after she became ill and the question of another visit to Zurich was raised in the summer, Einstein poured out his troubles in a long letter to a friend, who henceforth acted as honest broker between the couple. If he came to Zurich, he said, she would demand to see him, and he would have to refuse, partly because of his earlier decision, partly to avoid emotional scenes. The boys would think that he was being callous, and he really thought no good would come of it. This estrangement went on for 2 years, during which it was reported by Albert's friends that after being separated from his wife for so long, he had regained some of the innocent joy that he had always been known for. During this period, trench warfare stalled the conflict along both fronts. Freed from the distraction of his family, the physicist threw himself with reckless abandon into his work for the rest of 1916 and the better part of 1917. It isn't just a clever turn of phrase that you can work yourself so hard that you make yourself sick. For Einstein, the stress-induced illnesses hit hard in 1917. Clark writes that the illness was hardly surprising. For years, he had been deeply immersed in scientific work, which has been described as the greatest intellectual effort of any single human brain. His views on the war were diametrically opposed to those of the men and women around him. In addition, he was living in a makeshift existence which gave full rein to the inclination summed up by his doctor friend. As his mind knows no limits, so his body follows no set rules. He sleeps until he is wakened, his physician wrote. He stays awake until he is told to go to bed. He will go hungry until he is given something to eat, and then he eats until he is stopped. That Einstein, mentally hard-pressed and physically unorganized, should experience a breakdown in wartime Berlin is not to be wondered at. The surprise is that he avoided one for so long. His cousin Elsa fussed over him during his recovery. They would marry 2 years later in 1919. The organization IdeaPod points out that cousins marrying each other wasn't frowned upon at that time. Interestingly enough, Elsa and Albert were cousins on both sides. Their fathers were cousins and their mothers were sisters. They both spent their childhood together, forming a strong friendship. She called him Alberte when they were young. As adults, they reconnected when Albert moved to Berlin for work. Elsa was living there with her 2 daughters. She had been recently divorced from her first husband. Albert would visit often. The two began a romantic relationship, and the rest, as they say, is history. Elsa wouldn't prove to be a feminist icon, serving the dual role of Einstein's wife and maid, who cared for the basic needs that he oftentimes neglected. Unlike his first wife, a physicist in her own right, Elsa was content not to ask about her husband's work. Albert once told a friend that "I'm glad my wife doesn't know any science. My first wife did." Content was a word that is often used to describe her. When he achieved his fame, she acted as his gatekeeper. She also ran the business end of Einstein Incorporated, ensuring that they were able to make ends meet while preventing her husband's generosity from being taken advantage of. Clark reveals that without her, Einstein would also have made a fool of himself more often than he did, have issued more statements that he had to retract, signed more documents without reading them properly, and been used more frequently by men of ill will. Elsa knew the part that had been cut out for her, stating, "All I can do is to look after his outside affairs, take business matters off of his shoulders, and take care that he is not interrupted in his work." This doesn't mean that Elsa's own generosity wasn't taken advantage of. Albert engaged in a number of extramarital affairs, and although she didn't sanction such behavior, she was aware of her husband's wandering eye. Letters between the couple identify Marguerite, Estella, Tony, Ethel, and Margarita as lovers of the famous physicists. For those who think that even this revelation doesn't spice up Einstein to the point that he deserves his own first-class Hollywood biopic, that last one, Margarita, was a known Russian spy. "1919 would prove to be a pivotal year for the world as well as Albert Einstein. The end of 1918 had brought the war to its final inevitable conclusion, with the Kaiser abdicating on November 9th and Germany declaring itself defeated 2 days later. Prior to the signing of the armistice, the entrance of the United States and the failure of the German Spring Offensive allowed England and her allies to imagine an end to the war. It also freed up some resources which would allow England to man a mission to collect measurements for the upcoming May 29th solar eclipse. Additionally, the field of mathematics had advanced to the point that the precise mathematical term dimension had been added to the lexicon, allowing Einstein to better explain the effects that gravity had upon light. The Smithsonian Magazine tells us that according to Newton's law, if you shake the sun like a cosmic maraca, gravity will cause the Earth to immediately shake too. That is, Newton's formula implies that gravity exerts its influence from one location to another instantaneously. That's not only faster than light, it's infinite. Einstein would have none of it. A more refined description of gravity must surely exist, one in which gravitational influences do not outrun light. But conditions to test whether beams traveling at the speed of light bent to the force of gravity without slowing down required perfect viewing conditions, which Eddington, the man who successfully accomplished the feat, warned that it might have been necessary to wait some thousands of years for a total eclipse of the sun to happen on the lucky date. Although the war had ended before the actual date of the eclipse, the planning for it had required identifying positions within the path of the event across the Atlantic Ocean that would hopefully remain unseen by patrolling German U-boats. In Berlin, Einstein was initially unaware of the efforts that the British scientific community were taking in order to verify his theory. Assuming that the war would once again prevent him from gathering the data needed from an eclipse, he had become bogged down working towards furthering his understanding of the universe by challenging Newton's belief that the universe was infinite. The result of his work was to theorize that the universe contains a finite number of stars distributed equally through unbounded space. If that sounds contradictory to you, then you're in good company, as that contradiction resulted in Einstein viewing space as curved. He painted a picture with no favored location in the universe, no center, no boundary. All must see the universe alike everywhere and in all directions. The self-proclaimed science guys of Union University explained the implication by writing that, if curved, you could start anywhere in the universe, move in a straight line, and return to where you started after a long enough time. The current scientific consensus is that the universe space is expanding as a result of a tremendous explosion at the birth of our universe, the Big Bang. The universe's curvature has important implications for its future. One curvature implies an expansion for all time, open. Another implies that the expansion will someday cease and collapse, or will experience a big crunch, which will close it. In Germany, the big crunch had already come, with the Kaiser departing in favor of the Weimar Republic. Albert Einstein was an early supporter of the doomed government. Their task of rebuilding Germany, however, was made impossible by the terms imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Einstein was a part of the working committee of scientists which attempted to influence the victorious Allies to, quote, save the famished German population from starvation. Unfortunately, they didn't listen, and the treaty's reparations clause doomed the Weimar economy, while its war guilt clause resulted in the people of Germany who had suffered throughout the war turning their back on the government which now claimed to look after them. Freed from the dangers of war, Einstein immediately began a series of traveling lectures on relativity. It took some time, but eventually even England and France let Einstein, whom they all viewed as German, to come to them. Obviously, he enjoyed speaking on relativity, but beyond that, he viewed his travels as diplomatic work designed to heal the divides that had resulted in the war itself. His people-to-people diplomacy was remarkable, with hundreds coming to see him for each lecture in England, despite the fact that he spoke virtually no English. That means that the audience had to have his lectures translated in real time. Unfortunately, there is no translation for the language of science itself, and it is likely that most who attended had no clue what it was that the physicists actually said. He was also active within the newly formed League of Nations, the organization that had been hastily designed to prevent a Second World War. His fame was launched into the stratosphere on September 27, 1919. When word came via a telegram that Eddington found star displacement at rim of sun, preliminary measurement between 9/10 of a second and twice that value. Relativity had found its scientific proof. For some idiots, proof is meaningless. While the majority of the world reveled in Einstein's achievement at proving that Newton's law of the universe was incomplete, a small portion of the population began to plot his downfall. From the beginning, this minority group refused to remain silent. Economic hardship had set in for the people of Germany. Throughout the course of human history, there's been a clear link between economic recessions and a rise of hate speech and hate crimes. In Germany, that link most often took the form of anti-Semitism. Albert Einstein became the perfect target. He was exceptionally famous. He was Jewish. He publicly told everyone that he wasn't German, despite being born there and working there. While others sacrificed for victory, he had vehemently protested it and celebrated Germany's defeat. Einstein regularly traveled to England and France, two nations which had conspired to punish Germany. The growing mob were supported by scientists who weren't willing to fully accept relativity. J.J. Thomson was among them, telling those that would listen that we have Einstein's space, de Sitter's space, expanding universes, contracting universes, vibrating universes, mysterious universes. In fact, the pure mathematician may create universes just by writing down an equation. And indeed, if he is an individualist, he can have a universe of his own. The fallacy here is one of guilt by association, that the unrelated or speculative ideas of other scientists are used to cast doubt on Einstein's theory, without addressing the merits or evidence supporting relativity itself. It's essentially an attempt to undermine Einstein's theory by associating it with other ideas that may be considered unconventional or speculative. The anti-Einstein coalition was initially beaten back by the popularity of a man who had managed to transcend his genre. Contemporary Alexander Moskowski, who wrote the book Einstein the Searcher, proclaimed that upon the sight of Albert, women lost sight of domestic worries and discussed coordinate systems, the principle of simultaneity, and negatively charged electrons. All contemporary questions had gained a fixed center from which threads could be spun to each. Relativity had become the sovereign password. Within a year, more than 100 books on the subject of relativity were published, despite the fact that few could actually understand the theory. A cigar began to sell under the name the Einstein cigar, while new parents named their children after him. Hope for a better world was winning the day. Author Leopold Infeld explains it as a product of the times, writing that people were weary of hatred, of killing and international intrigues. The trenches, bombs, and murder had left a bitter taste. Books about war did not sell. Everyone looked for a new era of peace and wanted to forget the war. Here was something which captured the imagination, human eyes looking from an earth covered with graves and blood to the heavens covered with the stars. Abstract thought carrying the human mind far away from the sad and disappointing reality. The mystery of the sun's eclipse and of the penetrating power of the human mind. Scientists, which had belonged to two warring nations collaborating again, was seen by those who looked for signs as the beginning of a new hopeful era. But the Atlantic reminds us the underlying psychology of us and them appears grounded in deep-rooted human tendencies to carve the world into groups and discriminate in favor of one's own. The anti-Einstein coalition could not bear the thought of such lavish praise being heaped upon a man who, while denying his ties to Germany, spent the entire war hidden within the confines of the University of Berlin's library. The study group of German natural philosophers subsequently formed and offered substantial fees to anyone who wrote or spoke out against Einstein. Clark tells us that the group was buoyed by Nobel Prize winner Philip Leonard. Together, the group described relativity as part of a vast Semitic plot to corrupt the world in general and Germany in particular. Its attacks avoided scientific argument. Instead, they concentrated on the Jewish nature of relativity and on the personal character of Einstein. At its beginning, the study group appeared harmless to someone who had already achieved the heights of Einstein, who even appeared in the audience of one of their own meetings, laughing heartily and clapping along with the audience in mock applause. As the Weimar Republic flailed in the face of mounting war reparations, the nature of the attacks became more sinister, and threats upon his life became the norm. It got so bad that he considered leaving Berlin in August of 1920, but was talked out of it by close friends. The reason for his hesitancy was as simple as him calculating that Berlin remained the best location for him to continue his work. Clark writes that Einstein had weathered the first of the nationalist anti-Jewish storms for which he was to act as a lightning conductor. He momentarily escaped courtesy of an international tour, which included visits to countries as far-flung as America and Japan. Interestingly, he was co-opted by racists during the early stages of that trip when, after lecturing in Prague, one paper claimed that the whole world will now see that a race that has produced a man like Einstein, the Sudeten German race, will never be suppressed. It was also in Prague that a young man publicly claimed for the first time that it would be possible to use Einstein's work to utilize the energy locked within the atom for a new explosive device. As proof that the genius wasn't infallible, Albert personally told the student to calm yourself. You haven't lost anything if I don't discuss your work with you in detail. Its foolishness is evident at first glance. You cannot learn more from a longer discussion. Creating such a weapon would become the focus of Einstein in the next decade, as he and the free world sought a weapon that would prevent Adolf Hitler from taking over the world. In our next episode, we'll examine what happened to Albert Einstein after the anti-Einstein, anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists of Germany managed to seize the reins of power. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or contacting EmpiresPod on Bluesky. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.